action on the next draft under item 2. First of all, draft L.1 Rev.1, promoting reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka. To introduce the draft, the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom has the floor to introduce the draft. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Gracias, Señor Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I have the honour to introduce draft resolution L1 Rev.1 entitled Promoting Reconciliation, Accountability and Human Rights in Sri Lanka, which has been proposed by a group of states comprising Canada, Germany, Malawi, Montenegro, North Macedonia, the United States and the UK. The text is largely based on last year's resolution, but has been updated to reflect some of the key developments over the last 18 months in what has been a rather dramatic time for Sri Lanka, an economic crisis, mass protests and a change in government, all of which have had a significant bearing on the human rights situation in the country. The draft both recognises the challenges which Sri Lanka has faced during the period and acknowledges progress where this has occurred. It reflects some of the more recent concerns outlined in the High Commissioner's report, especially the human rights impact of the economic crisis. And it also addresses several long-standing issues which still need to be addressed. These include the lack of accountability for past violations, the many unresolved cases of enforced disappearances, the need for Sri Lanka to meet its own commitments on the devolution of political authority, as well as the need to uphold the rights of all people in Sri Lanka, including Tamils and Muslims. The main requests in the resolution are in operative paragraphs 8 and 18. Paragraph 8 seeks to continue the work initiated in last year's resolution, which created capacity within the Office of the High Commissioner to collect, consolidate, analyse and preserve information to support judicial and other proceedings. This capacity was set up in response to the lack of progress made by Sri Lanka's domestic legal mechanisms towards accountability for past alleged gross violations of human rights. Unfortunately, this capacity has only been fully operational since May of this year and so requires more time to complete its mandate. We are therefore seeking to extend it for a further period as recommended by the former High Commissioner. Paragraph 18 requests further reporting by the OHCHR and proposes to move from an 18-month timeframe to 2 years. This is in recognition of the severe challenges which Sri Lanka is currently facing, allowing Sri Lanka sufficient time and space to make progress on human rights in what we all recognise is a very difficult context. Mr. President, the UK is a close partner to and a long-standing friend of Sri Lanka. Our ties run deep. We bring this resolution in order to help Sri Lanka address ongoing challenges and in order to encourage progress on reconciliation, justice and human rights. I commend this draft resolution to my fellow members of this Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. La Secretaría me ha informado.
The Secretariat has informed me that the draft L.1 Rev.1 has 3 additional sponsors. I now give the floor to Member States of the Council wishing to make general comments. The delegation of France has the floor. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, France thanks the sponsors of this resolution. Indeed, it is important for this Council to continue monitoring the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka and support the authorities in their efforts towards reconciliation and reconstruction that they are already engaged in. In this respect, France welcomes the wish on the part of the new authorities to cooperate with the international community and with UN mechanisms. The resumption of cooperation with the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights will be an important phase in guaranteeing the protection of the rights of Sri Lankans. It is naturally important for the Council to take into account the extremely difficult situation the country is going through economically. We express our solidarity with the people of Sri Lanka and will continue to join with international efforts to provide it with the humanitarian aid it requires and to meet its long-term challenges. It is in this spirit that France supports this draft resolution. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Any other delegations wishing to make general comments? I see none. I see there are no delegations requesting the floor. So I now give the floor to the country concerned. I give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Sri Lanka. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Mr. President,
Excuse me, the Minister.
Regrettable that
Excuse me, the Minister of
Foreign Affairs. A country-specific resolution against Sri Lanka, despite our continued and constructive engagement with this Council on multiple fronts. It is yet another example of the unfortunate divisions and polarization of this Council, which is contrary to its founding principle that, I quote, "The work of the Council shall be guided by principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity, constructive international dialogue and cooperation." Sri Lanka categorically rejects the draft resolution HRC/51/L1 presented without our consent despite our effort to engage with the main sponsors. While this resolution may meet the objective of advancing the domestic political consideration of the sponsors, it manifestly unhelpful to Sri Lanka. We call on the members of this Council to reject it by a vote. Mr. President, the list of co-sponsors of the draft resolution amply demonstrate its divisive nature. Last year, many countries braved intense pressure by powerful sponsors and opposed Resolution 46/1 or abstained in the vote. This year, we thank the countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America who supported Sri Lanka during the informal consultation on this draft. Sri Lanka categorically rejects the resolution, particularly proposal in OP8. As we have repeatedly stated, this so-called external evidence-gathering mechanism will have wide-ranging legal and political implications for all countries. Such unprecedented and ad hoc expansion of the mandate of the Council and the functions of a technical secretariat were never envisaged when this Council was established. No sovereign state can accept the superimposition of an external mechanism that runs contrary to the Constitution and which prejudges the commitment of its domestic legal processes. The Council may take note of this. Many countries have already raised serious concern on the budgetary implication of this resolution given its ever-expanding mandates. This is an unhelpful and misdirected drain on the resources of all member states, including the donors, in the midst of an ongoing global crisis. In sharp contrast, we are faced with the dire financial needs of our developing countries to prevent hunger and child malnutrition. We strongly object to the draft resolution pronouncing on domestic economic and financial policy matters which are outside the framework of this forum. Solution to economic and financial crisis faced today by many countries will not be found in the mandate, instrument, or expertise of this Council. Further, it is deeply regrettable that this rambling resolution, running into several pages, ignores the institutional and political stability restored in Sri Lanka, despite the significant political and social challenges. Mr. President, as I outlined in my previous intervention, Sri Lanka remains firmly committed to pursuing tangible progress on human rights throughout our domestic institutions. This includes replacing PTA with a comprehensive national security legislation, the introduction of a constitutional amendment, and a legal framework to strengthen the democratic governance, participation, and rule of law, as well as independent institutional oversight. On reconciliation and human rights, the contours of a domestic truth-seeking mechanism is under advanced discussion as we await the final report of the Presidential Commission. We are of the firm view that any solution should be within the constitutional framework of a sovereign Sri Lanka. On our further engagement with this Council, we look forward to domestic consultation in preparation for our upcoming UPR process. Today, Sri Lanka is making gradual and difficult progress in resolving severe financial situation we are facing. Globally, it is clear that the causes for the prevailing economic crisis affecting all countries are not entirely internal, but also external. We are deeply concerned about many hardships faced by our people and have made provisions for the necessary social protection measures. Sri Lanka has overcome many challenges in the past. We have ended decades of separatist terrorism, successfully managed the human health dimension of the pandemic, and despite economic challenges, succeeded in maintaining a high rank in the Human Development Index, which is the highest in the region. We aspire to build on the economic, political, and social stability restored in the recent months with the support of all our people, including through outreach to the overseas Sri Lankan, in a just, fair, and inclusive society which realizes the full enjoyment of the human rights and fundamental freedom. In these circumstances, it is regrettable that this resolution has been tabled. The North-South divide is clearly reflected in the consideration of this resolution as well as in the voting results of the previous resolution on Sri Lanka. For all the above reasons, Sri Lanka rejects this draft resolution and requests the members of this Council to reject this resolution by a vote. Thank you.
Le agradezco al distinguido ministro de...
I would like to thank the distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka for his presence here in this room this afternoon. The Secretariat has told me that there are budgetary implications in the program for this resolution to the tune of $6,092,300 US. A copy of the declaration has been published on the Council's extranet. I would now like to give the floor to members of the Council that wish to offer explanations of vote prior to voting. Pakistan. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Pakistan has been a consistent advocate for dialogue and cooperation as preferred means to advance universal respect for and enjoyment of human rights. We strongly believe that engagement and consent of the country concerned remain crucial to address human rights concerns and promote compliance with states' international human rights obligations. We appreciate Sri Lanka's active and constructive engagement throughout the informal consultations on the draft text. This demonstrates its commitment to cooperate with international human rights machinery, including this Council. We share the concerns of Sri Lanka and a number of other states that the draft text is intrusive and goes beyond the core group's originally conceived objective of promoting accountability and reconciliation in Sri Lanka in the context of civil war in 2009. The current text delves into areas such as governance, economic management, corruption, rule of law, democratic process, as well as Sri Lanka's engagement with international financial institutions. This level of scrutiny and intrusion, as envisaged in preambular paragraphs PPs 8, 9, 10, and operative paragraphs 4, 5, and 8, would not be even acceptable to any sovereign state, including the core group. Mr. President, L.1 Rev.1 fails to condemn the horrendous terrorist acts committed by LTTE and shies away from a call for accountability of the LTTE and its sponsors and financiers. During the course of informal consultations, a number of states had explained that OP8 lacks balance, proportionality, and consistency, including with other key elements of the draft text. For example, PPs 5 and 17 of the text reaffirm the sovereignty of Sri Lanka and welcome its continued engagement with the UN and its human rights mechanisms. However, these provisions are at complete variance with the legally untenable external accountability mechanism as foreseen in OP8. We note that such provisions are neither grounded in nor are drawn from the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, the founding UNGA Resolution 60/251, and the IB package. Mr. President, at a critical time when the people of Sri Lanka expect demonstration of global solidarity and support to overcome its economic challenges, which are not entirely of Sri Lanka's own making, the core group chose a path that has the potential to exacerbate the problems instead of improving the situation, including with respect to the ongoing efforts towards accountability and reconciliation. Although impacts may vary depending on level of development and economy's resilience, but the last 3 years have clearly shown that no single country can claim immunity from the devastating socio-economic impacts of COVID, global liquidity crunch, and the climate catastrophe. Mr. President, in view of these reasons, Pakistan delegations call the draft resolution to vote and would vote against it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Brazil is recognized.
Muito obrigado, caríssimo senhor presidente. Brazil thanks the core group for presenting the draft resolution on Sri Lanka. We take note with appreciation of the engagement of Sri Lanka during the negotiations as a proof of goodwill. We agree with their comments regarding the need to avoid politicization of the work of the Council and reiterate our position that the engagement and cooperation of the concerned country is key to the success of the Council's initiatives. While we acknowledge that progress was achieved on the ground in Sri Lanka, we understand that many countries believe the situation of the country remains of interest to this Council. We welcome the fact that the final text acknowledges the efforts undergone by the government to address the ongoing economic crisis and its commitment towards institutional reforms, but also highlights the important challenges regarding the full enjoyment of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Sri Lankan people. During the negotiations, Brazil proposed amendments aimed at bringing balance to the text and within the Council's agenda. We would like to thank the core group for incorporating some of our proposals, which rendered the final text a more constructive approach. We regret, however, that our proposal to strengthen the technical cooperation and assistance dimension of the text was not taken on board. In light of recent Sri Lankan efforts and constructive engagement, it is our belief that this resolution should have a greater focus on the responsibility of the international community to support the country in its recovery, including through international cooperation and assistance. We believe this resolution would be better framed under our agenda item 10. In light of these considerations, Brazil will abstain on the draft resolution on Sri Lanka. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Japan has the floor.
Gracias, Señor Presidente. Japan has duly taken note of the discussion on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, including at the informal consultation with the member states and various stakeholders. While recognizing the work done by the Sri Lanka government to date, Japan is of the view that various steps will need to be taken in order to improve the human rights situation and to foster reconciliation in the country. Japan therefore emphasizes the need for Sri Lanka to take further necessary measures. The government of Sri Lanka is primarily responsible for improving the human rights situation in the country. Japan strongly believes that the government's own initiative, efforts, and commitments are indispensable to achieve real change on the ground. Japan considers it preferable for the international society to foster Sri Lanka's own efforts to improve the human rights situation in the country. For these reasons, Japan will abstain from voting on this draft resolution. Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you. China has the floor.
Mr. President, China appreciates the Sri Lankan government's commitment to promoting and protecting human rights, advancing sustainable socio-economic development, improving living standards, protecting the rights of vulnerable groups, facilitating national reconciliation, and combating terrorism. As a long-time friendly neighbor of Sri Lanka, China firmly supported in safeguarding national sovereignty and independence, maintaining social stability, and achieving economic recovery. We believe that the Sri Lankan government is able to lead the people to overcome the difficulties. We note with appreciation that the delegation of Sri Lanka actively participated in the consultations on the draft resolution with the utmost goodwill and made constructive comments. However, regrettably, the co-sponsors obstinately ignored the views of the country concerned, especially its opposition to extending the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. We regret this. This draft resolution, in disregard of the efforts and achievements made by the government in promoting and protecting human rights, and without consent by the country concerned, is yet another product of a politicization, and will by no means play any positive role in the promotion and protection of human rights in Sri Lanka. The work of this Council should be guided by the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. All parties should promote and protect human rights through genuine dialogue and cooperation, and refrain from adopting double standards and politicizing human rights issues. China maintains that all countries should abide by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, respect the sovereignty and independence of other countries, and reject the practice of using human rights as a pretext to interfere in the internal affairs and undermine the sovereignty of other countries to the detriment of international cooperation. In view of the above, China will vote against draft resolution L.1 Rev.1 and calls on other members of this council to jointly reject it. I thank you, sir.
Gracias.
Thank you. India has the floor.
Mr. President, as an immediate neighbor, India has substantively contributed to the relief, rehabilitation, resettlement, and reconstruction process in Sri Lanka after 2009. More recently, since January this year, India has stepped up and provided unprecedented assistance to the people of Sri Lanka to face the challenges of the recent economic crisis. In finding a lasting and effective solution for peace and reconciliation in Sri Lanka, India has always been guided by the two fundamental principles of support to the aspirations of the Tamil for equality, justice, dignity, and peace and unity, territorial integrity and sovereignty of Sri Lanka. While we have taken note of the commitments by the government of Sri Lanka on issues of implementation of the commitments in the spirit of the 13th Constitutional Amendment, meaningful devolution, and the early conduct of provincial elections, we believe that the progress towards the same remains inadequate. Accordingly, we urge the government of Sri Lanka to work meaningfully towards early implementation of these commitments. Achieving prosperity for all Sri Lankans and realizing the legitimate aspirations of Tamils of Sri Lanka for prosperity, dignity, and peace are the two sides of the same coin. Mr. President, India will continue to work with Sri Lanka and the international community to attain the related objectives of legitimate aspirations of Tamils of Sri Lanka and prosperity for all Sri Lankans. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra República de Corea.
The Republic of Korea has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea notes with appreciation that the government of Sri Lanka has made various efforts to promote national reconciliation, reconstruction, and prosperity. These efforts notably include the establishment of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry, the operation of Office of Missing Persons, and the Office of Reparation, the introduction of the National Reparation Policy and Guidelines, and the proposed amendment to the Constitution, which aims to restore the independence of key national institutions and the judiciary. We take particular note that the government of Sri Lanka has made continued efforts to promote the human rights situation even during this difficult time of economic crisis. As a country which went through a turbulent period of democratization, the Republic of Korea has been a supporter of Sri Lanka's transitional process. When assuming the chairmanship of the UN Peacekeeping Commission in 2017, Korea convened the first meeting on Sri Lanka. We also supported the country's transitional process through the Peace Building Fund. However, in the hope that Sri Lanka will achieve tangible progress through the close cooperation with the international community, including the UN human rights mechanisms, the Republic of Korea has decided to maintain its previous voting position on the resolution. We will continue to examine our stance as we closely monitor the progress on the ground. The Republic of Korea sincerely hopes that the governments of Sri Lanka will make further advancements in national reconstruction and reconciliation, and also looks forward to closely cooperating with the Sri Lankan government. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la...
Thank you. Venezuela has the floor. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Venezuela would like to reiterate its position on this elective practice of some countries in this council. With merely political means, they present initiatives such as this draft resolution L.1 Rev.1 against the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. Such initiatives do not have the support of the concerned country and violate the principles of the respective sovereignty and non-meddling in the domestic affairs of states. We're deeply concerned that in the text of the draft resolution, it continues to be an effort to give competencies and attributions to the Office of the High Commissioner to collect criminal evidence for future criminal trials for the criminal body, in violation of the mandate included in Resolution 48-141 of the General Assembly that created it. It is regrettable that the sponsors of the draft resolution insist on imposing, through this hostile initiative, monitoring and oversight mechanisms against Sri Lanka without its consent, thereby ignoring the great efforts made by its government in fulfilling its commitments in the area of human rights since the restoration of peace in 2009. Mr. President, Venezuela rejects, given that it is unjustified, all external affairs and meddling in the domestic affairs of Sri Lanka as it seeks out its national reconciliation. We warn about the great risk of draft resolutions that are biased with interventionist slants, that reiterate selective procedures of some hegemonic countries and their allies in this council, affronting the independence and sovereignty of countries in the South. Thus, we condemn the selectivity, politicization, and double standards clearly visible in these initiatives that set forth hostile mandates with which they try to preserve dark interests of those that drive them, and that additionally financially bleed out the system with over $6 million that could have been better used to support the least developed countries in their human rights situations. This practice of wasting money seems to be all too common these days in the Council. Some governments of the countries that promote these draft resolutions have carried out and continue to carry out severe violations of human rights, and against them, unfortunately, no similar initiatives are made. They actively cooperate with the mechanism this office and the Office of the High Commissioner Sri Lanka does, showing the great achievements made in its people's promotion and protection of human rights. This draft resolution is unjustifiable, and Venezuela is against draft L.1 Rev.1, voting against when the voting comes, urging further all members of the Council to act in a similar way. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I don't see any additional requests for the floor. At the behest of the delegation of Pakistan, the Council will now move to a vote, a registered vote on draft resolution L.1 Rev.1. I would like to ask the Secretariat to open the voting machine and request delegations to register their vote, please.
Han registrado todas las delegaciones su voto.
All delegations have registered their vote. I would ask you to please double check and see if your vote is properly reflected on the screen. And if so, I would like to ask the Secretariat to close the voting machine. The results of the registered vote as I was saying, the results of the registered vote are as follows. 20 votes in favor, 7 against, 20 abstentions, which is why draft L.1 Rev.1, Promotion of Reconciliation, Accountability, and Human Rights in Sri Lanka, is adopted.